All right. My name is Polly Lorien, and I'm excited to be interviewing Lori McLaren. She's a deaf educator and a wonderful friend. And today, interpreting for us is Beth Adler. This is a project for my educational psychology class. And we're going to be discussing, what are we discussing? What do hearing teachers need to know about connecting with their deaf students, especially considering the link between voice and identity and between language and culture? So first, I'll ask Lori if you could please introduce yourself and maybe talk a little about your experiences, not only as a deaf teacher, but as a deaf student.
Okay, sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you for asking me to participate in this interview. I was 18 months old when it was determined that I was deaf. We don't know back then, we didn't have the technology to know if I was born deaf or not, but that's when it was first identified. I entered a school for the deaf and hard of hearing at the age of 4. It was a public school, and I stayed within that program until I graduated. Most of my schooling was mainstream, meaning that I was interacting a lot of times with other deaf, other hearing students rather, but I had what's called self-contained classrooms where I would have my studies with other deaf kids. So when I was mainstreamed in most of my classes, like I said, I was typically the only deaf student in a classroom full of hearing students with a hearing teacher. I did go to college in New York to get an associate's in accounting. And once I started working, I realized this is not for me. And also, as a deaf person working in a hearing system, it was very challenging too, as far as communication. So I went on to get a bachelor's and then a master's in deaf education. So if I can back up just a little, the interpreter's just getting some clarification. I worked for 10 years as a paraprofessional in the school system, which is what led me to realize that I wanted myself to become a teacher. So then I got the elementary education degree and then my master's in deaf education. And I have been teaching ever since for a total of 21 years now as a teacher of the deaf. And I'm actually teaching at the very public school where I was a student.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Cool. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between voice and identity as it relates to deaf students, especially?
Sure. When a deaf student is young, they don't know their identity, especially if they are mainstreamed in a public school, learning surrounded by hearing peers and teachers. So they're seeing a hearing identity. They don't know yet from models or adults about their own deaf identity. So when I was a child, I didn't know much about American Sign Language, for example, or deaf history. A lot of my signing, I sort of mimicked English word order, for example. I didn't realize how rich American Sign Language was. And a lot of the thinking for the people around me was that I should be more like them, like I should learn to speak and use English and kind of assimilate to hearing culture. So as a young person who's deaf, you really don't see, you have your own identity. You don't see that. Oftentimes that happens in college where you're surrounded by other deaf young people and you realize that, oh, we do have a shared language and we do have a shared culture. And so that's when, for me specifically, but also for many other deaf young adults, that's where the identity develops. So this, of course, has a huge impact on deaf kids when they're in school with hearing kids. At a deaf school, it's very different. At a deaf school, sign language is used. There are adults who are deaf, who are signing, who act as role models. And so that really encourages an identity and a voice among the deaf students and creates a sense of pride.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you. So with so many deaf students nowadays being mainstreamed, what do hearing teachers need to know to be able to connect and be effective and supportive to their deaf students?
So if a school has a teacher of the deaf or an interpreter, a hearing teacher could really take advantage of learning from them. Those are going to be the resources that can tell you about deaf culture and language. So if your school doesn't have a teacher of the deaf or interpreters, I suggest you find somebody as a resource because, you know, oftentimes without exposure, you just don't know. A hearing teacher is going to assume things based on being hearing, based on listening and speaking. And so by nature, they might try to apply that to a deaf student. But a deaf student might not want that approach. They might not want to act like a hearing person, for example. They might want to be deaf and all that entails, whether it's sign language, history, culture. So my suggestion would be that a hearing teacher does their research. It's important for you to learn about working with this student. And really to find appropriate resources, to find people who can talk to you about working with deaf students.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about how certain, some deaf people choose to vocalize and some choose not to? And I guess that's a part of students not knowing yet their identity. They may not have tried speaking, or they may have been forced into oralism that they're not comfortable with. So what do hearing teachers need to know about vocalizing and where that stands with deaf culture, but the deaf culture perspective on vocalizing?
Sure. So if a student is deaf, and I use that word in a way that I mean profoundly deaf, but culturally deaf, that's going to be hard for that student to rely on listening in sound. And they're probably going to prefer using ASL. I mean, hearing people can imagine being asked to use ASL out of the blue it would be hard for you. So you can kind of imagine it that way. So again, hearing folks in schools are using English primarily. And of course, you value that language. But for deaf folks, we value ASL. It's a huge part of our culture. That being said, there are several deaf and hard of hearing people out there that do want to use spoken language. They want to use their voice, a spoken voice. It is important to remember too that many people were, like you said, forced into using speech without a choice. So there's a lot of resentment within the community because of that forced oralism. So that's important to consider. For parents who can hear when they have a baby who they find out is deaf, it's a huge process for them. It does involve grieving because it's not what they expected. Now, their first interaction usually is with medical doctors and audiologists, for example, and they are often told that their child should be fixed, quote unquote. And so that causes a lot of fear and pressure on parents. And of course, parents highly regard doctors. And so they often follow that advice and enroll kids in speech pathology, etc. And it's very hard for those parents. But those kids oftentimes eventually decide they don't want to participate in speech and language. Like for me, example, by the time I was in 8th grade, I said, nope. Once I was given a choice, I said, nope, I'm not doing that anymore. There are some kids, however, that do want to continue using speech. We're a very diverse group, so there's no one size fits all for deaf people, but I think it's safe to say that speech is not usually a priority within the community.
That's important for hearing teachers to know. It sounds like it's a very personal choice that kids, especially as they're growing and learning, have to explore the options and choose for themselves. Well, obviously this is a huge topic that we could spend all day on, but we're going to keep it short and sweet. I'm so grateful to you, Lori, for your insight and expertise. Is there one more?
My pleasure. Thank you.
Is there any more? Is there one last tidbit or bit of advice you'd like to offer if when hearing teachers realize they get to have a deaf student, that they should keep in the front of their minds?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really important to always try to put yourself in the deaf student's shoes. And of course, that's very challenging for many people. But try to learn about their world. So for example, if you have a student from another country, oftentimes it's second nature for teachers to learn a little bit about the student and their culture and their language. So it really should be the same when they start working with a deaf student. That's really important.
Yeah, excellent point. Thank you. Well, I look forward to continuing these conversations another day. And thank you so much, Beth, for your help in facilitating. All right, that's all, folks.